Welcome back to History on Your Doorstep, the series which introduces you to the extraordinary past hidden in the most ordinary of places. Last episode, we were at a real archaeological dig right in the centre of St Albans. Today, we're going to look at how we can use archaeological evidence found at those digs to try to explore the lives of everyday people from Roman Britain. When you think of the woman of Verulamium, it's likely that the first person you think of is Boudica, but she didn't live here. The Iceni originated up in Norfolk. So can we get to the regular women of this town? Can we know what they look like? Archaeologist and former guest curator at Verulamium Museum, Lexi Diggins, used archaeological evidence in an exhibition to try to do just that. How much do we know about daily life for women in Verulamium?
So on the surface, you might think that women who were living in Verulamium or in the earlier Iron Age settlement of Verulamium might just have been sitting about wearing jewellery or carrying out domestic chores like cooking and looking after children. That's what you'll see on the surface. If you do a quick scan of the artefacts, that's not really the full picture. In some ways, if you're looking for interesting evidence of women having a more prominent role in society, it's better to start with the Iron Age, because we've got Roman writers who describe British tribeswomen as having gone into battle with their menfolk. And we know that during the early Roman period in Britain, Boudica's leading the Iceni into battle. We've got more recent genetic evidence and archaeology for women staying in their communities and men coming in to start families with them. This is thanks to research by Dr. Lara Cassidy at Trinity College Dublin and archaeologists at Bournemouth University. They analysed DNA from about 50 individuals buried at Winterbourne, Kingston. And these are people who lived from around 100 BC to 100 AD. The study found that husbands were joining their wives' families or married. And this means that women weren't having to leave their support network, and they were keeping land and wealth in their communities, in their families. The research also discovered a very strong female line of descent, with nearly all these individuals tracing their lineage back to one woman who'd lived centuries earlier. This is called matrilocality, and it happened at other sites from a similar time frame in Cornwall and Yorkshire. It's very likely that this was happening in a quite widespread fashion during the Iron Age. So this idea that Boudica and also Cartimandua, who was queen of the Brigantes, this idea that they were unusual in some way, doesn't really sit right, in my opinion.
Cartimandua's tribe, the Brigantes, seems to have spread across a huge portion of northern England and may have even extended beyond Hadrian's Wall. She was in power before Boudica's rebellion and for long afterwards, but she's nowhere near as well known. She was a client queen for the Romans, so their forces could maintain control, but didn't actually have to go through all the effort of occupying such a huge region of Britain. Cartimandua is actually the only leader Tacitus explicitly calls a queen. Boudica is never given the title. He's actually sort of obsessed with her. She's mentioned 3 times in his books. Cartimandua is presented as the opposite of Boudica, working with the Romans, handing over British rebels and even betraying her ex-husband. Though of course, Tacitus might be lying. Being a Roman historian, the opportunity to prove why you should never let a woman gain so much power over men was probably irresistible to him. But to Britons, living under her rule may have been normal.
I think it's more likely that women having more parity with men was more of a norm, more of a cultural norm. And that would have changed, unfortunately, for women when Britain became part of the Roman Empire. Because in Roman culture, women's role was very much about virtue, domesticity, being wives, being daughters, and not so much about being a warrior or holding land or holding power. For the exhibition that I did at Verulamium, we focused on Boudica, and we were very careful to make sure that when we portrayed her, we were very authentic in terms of what she was wearing and what she was carrying. We don't know, obviously, what she looked like. We just have accounts from Roman writers. But we do have some archaeological evidence for the Iron Age, for the sorts of things that women wore. I used archaeological evidence of jewellery that was found at that time, weapons that were found at that time, and reconstructed Boudica from those items. So they're not necessarily exactly what Boudica wore, but they are what people were wearing, were carrying. Like I said, I think there are clues in archaeology that maybe are not so obvious about how women lived day to day. Things like funerary markers. So during the Roman period, there are stone markers that are put up for wives, for daughters by their husbands, by their fathers, which is really lovely. Often they are depicted with objects relating to either wealth or domesticity. We have this stone funeral marker, which is from South Shields, which used to be called Fort Albert, and it was a military outpost during the Roman occupation. And there's a lovely tombstone that was found there, put up by someone called Barates, who was a Palmyrian. So he was from Palmyra in Syria, and he joined either the Roman army or maybe he was carrying out business relating to the Roman army. My suspicion, and it's only a suspicion, was that he was probably involved with trade to do with the Roman army. He put up a marker, and Regina, we know that was her name because he described her name. We also know that she was about 30 years old when she died, and that she had once been enslaved, but he could have freed her upon marriage. We also know that she was a member of the Catavaloni tribe, which is the link to Verulamium. So we don't know whether she came from Verulamium, but she came from somewhere in the land the Catavaloni occupied, and Verulamium was the largest Roman settlement. So there is a possibility that he met her. He may even have bought her at a slave market. So that's how we know about Regina, and we know that she then moved up to South Shields. So she moved from somewhere down in the southeast of Britain to South Shields, and probably the weather did not improve for her. The other woman that I found that was named, because it is really difficult to find evidence of named women other than tombstones, they excavated a site that was a deposit of spiritual offerings. There'd been a temple site just outside Ashwell, and the base of a statue was found, and the inscription was made by a woman called Flavia Canoris. Flavia is a Roman name. Canoris is more of a sort of ancient British Celtic name. So it shows some assimilation of Roman culture. The objects, including this little base and silver statue that went with it, dates to the 2nd century AD. So we're looking at maybe 2nd or 3rd generation of people who are living after the Roman occupation.
Sununa was unknown until the Ashwell hoard was discovered in 2002. It seems that she's an example of synchronism, the combining of beliefs. She's probably a combination of the Roman goddess Minerva and an unknown British goddess.
One of the other women that I was able to find evidence for, named women, was Sabina. So there's a fragment of Samian pottery. Samian is the sort of upmarket pottery of the Roman world. A lot of the Samian that we find in the UK originated in Gaul, which is modern-day France. And this fragment was excavated during the Shepherd Frere digs in the 1950s. And someone called Sabina had scratched her name into the bottom of the pottery. She may have done that because she wanted to make sure that no one else took her bowl. It was beautifully decorated with running hares. And I thought really hard about, could I create a person from Sabina? And I looked for evidence in the archaeological archive for, had women or children been involved in pottery making? And there is evidence in France, actually, for women and children to be involved. And so I thought, okay, let's make Sabina a pottery apprentice and give her a bit of a backstory that she's been trying for a long while to persuade a master potter to take her on. All of these women we know definitely existed, which is really unusual. To find evidence for named women is unusual.
As Lexi mentioned, it can be difficult to find evidence for Roman women outside of funerary inscriptions and offerings, but we wouldn't know anything about the woman at Verulamium if it wasn't for the woman who initially dug it, Tessa Wheeler.
Tessa Wheeler was an archaeologist, and she was born in South Africa in, I think, about 1893, and she grew up in London, studied at UCL, studied history. She never finished her degree. She married Mortimer Wheeler. Mortimer became far more well-known than Tessa, but that really shouldn't have happened because she was probably one of the most pivotal female archaeologists to come out of Great Britain. I wanted to research more about Tessa. I always knew that she had a link with Verulamium because I remember going there with my school when I was about 11 years old. And there's a dedication to her. When I started the work for the exhibition and the research, I discovered that there'd been a young schoolgirl on the dig who volunteered across all of the seasons in the 1930s. And she'd kept a diary, a written diary, and she had photographs as well that she'd put into 2 little albums. And incredibly, for someone so young, because she was only 13, she'd almost kept like a verbatim diary of what people were saying to each other on the dig. So little conversations between Mortimer and Tessa, Tessa and herself, and then the other archaeologists. And then with the photographs too, I managed to piece together what had happened across those 3 digs.
Helen Carlton-Smith was affectionately known as Helen of Troy by those on the dig. It is because of Helen's diaries that we know a lot about Tessa and her teaching methods. Helen tells us that Tessa pioneered a mosaic removal method created in Italy. She worked out this method having never seen the process in real life. But it wasn't just young people like Helen at the dig. Tessa's team seems to have been pretty diverse. There was a group of Welsh miners who followed her from Caerleon. At the time, it was unusual for miners to take part in the actual archaeology rather than just the initial heavy labour, but we know they did, partly due to Helen. Photographs from the dig also show us 2 young men, who are referred to as Mr. Varner and Nate. They may have been UCL students, but we don't really know. How much was Tessa actually responsible for in the digs at Verulamium?
Nearly everything, surprisingly. Like, I couldn't believe it when I started to read Helen's diaries, and then I was looking at the photos as well. It turns out she was pretty much the project director. So she'd be the equivalent in modern archaeology. We have project managers, project directors. She was that. Mortimer was there at the beginning. He would help determine to what extent they were going to dig and where they were going to put their trenches. So he'd be involved from that point of view. And he might come towards the end of the day and have a look at what they found. But he was quite interested in the Iron Age landscape around St Albans, Redbourne, Wheathampstead. So he was often out, either on horseback or in a car, looking at other sites. So day to day, Tessa was doing everything from recruiting individuals, paying staff, making sure people had enough food and drink, and training people. So one of the key roles that she had on site was to train archaeologists. And that's why she is so pivotal as a female archaeologist, because she trained so many people that then went on to become very, very well-known archaeologists.
One of these archaeologists was Kathleen Kenyon, who was given the responsibility of excavating the Roman theatre by the Wheelers. Tessa also trained Peggy Preston, who is best known for the Sutton Hoo excavations, and is portrayed in the Netflix film The Dig. If you haven't caught on already, lack of certainty is a running theme in the ancient period. We may never know what these women look like or the exact events of their everyday lives. But if we use our evidence creatively, we can see small windows into the everyday. And it's this evidence that we can thank Tessa Wheeler for and the countless archaeologists she inspired. Tessa died unexpectedly in 1936, and she's buried in St Albans. Helen tells us she hated saying goodbye and preferred to say au revoir. So in the spirit of Tessa, au revoir.